Chicago, 1893. Night falls over the city, heavy and thick with coal smoke. In the central station, a beast of iron hisses steam, ready to depart into the darkness of the Midwest. But this is not just any train. Hooked behind the locomotive, glowing under the gas lamps, is a string of carriages that do not seem to belong in this dirty, industrial world. They are palaces on wheels. If you had the money to buy a ticket that night, stepping into one of these cars was like crossing a portal into another dimension. You left behind the soot, the cold, and the misery of the street to enter a sanctuary of hand-carved mahogany, crimson velvet curtains, Persian rugs so thick your footsteps made no sound, and crystal chandeliers that tinkled softly with the motion of the train. An impeccably dressed man, always a black man, would greet you with a smile and prepare a bed for you with starched silk sheets, more comfortable than the ones in your own home. You could dine on filet mignon served on French porcelain while the wild landscape of America flew by at 50 miles per hour on the other side of the glass. It was the absolute definition of the American dream. It was the pinnacle of civilization. It was the Pullman brand. But if you could look past the velvet, past the shine of the silver cutlery and the rehearsed smiles of the servants, you would see that this palace was built on a powder keg. Because the man who created this empire, George Mortimer Pullman, did not just want to build the best trains in the world. He wanted to redesign human society. He wanted to own not just the labor of his employees, but their lives, their homes, their churches, and even their souls. And that ambition, that godlike arrogance, would unleash one of the bloodiest conflicts in the history of the United States, a war that would pit the U.S. Army against the workers and leave a permanent scar on the national psyche. Pullman is not just a story about antique trains. It is the story of how a corporate utopia turns into a dystopian prison. It is the story of a man who believed he was a benevolent god and ended up being remembered as a tyrant whose corpse had to be buried under tons of concrete and steel for fear that his own employees would dig him up to desecrate him. How do you go from being the hero of industry, the man who civilized the frontier, to being the most hated man in America? To understand the final derailment, we first have to board the train. Before we start this journey into the heart of industrial America, I have an urgent request for you. We are pouring a brutal amount of hours into researching these fallen empires, digging through archives, and editing these stories to ensure they have the quality you deserve. Right now, we are fighting hard to achieve monetization and ensure that Empire Dust stays alive. If you value this content, if you want to keep seeing deep dive, uncensored documentaries, please take 2 seconds to hit that subscribe button. It is a tiny gesture for you. It is free, but for us, it is the difference between keeping going or stopping. Help us keep history alive. Thank you. Now, all aboard. The story of this empire begins, ironically, with a coffin. The year is 1865. The American Civil War has just ended. The country is shattered, divided, and bleeding. And then, the unthinkable happens. President Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. The nation enters a state of shock and deep mourning. Lincoln's body must be transported from Washington, D.C. to his final resting place in Springfield, Illinois. It is a journey of nearly 1,700 miles through a grieving country. Millions of people are lining the tracks to see the funeral train pass. But there was a logistical problem. Lincoln's coffin was large, and the dignitaries, generals, and politicians who were to accompany the body needed transport worthy of a national martyr. Train cars of the era were, to put it mildly, torture chambers. They were narrow wooden boxes, with hard benches, poor ventilation, and a rattling motion so violent it made it impossible to sleep or even drink a glass of water without spilling it. Train travel in 1860 was an endurance test, not a pleasure. Enter George Pullman, Pullman was not a born railway engineer. He was a businessman, a problem solver. He had made his first fortune in Chicago doing something that seemed impossible, lifting entire buildings with hydraulic jacks to install sewer systems underneath them, while people continued working inside. He had a mind for engineering, but above all, he had an eye for marketing. Years earlier, Pullman had experienced the torture of an overnight train ride and had an epiphany. He realized that as America expanded west, the distances were becoming enormous. Businessmen, the wealthy, the emerging class, they were not going to tolerate sitting on a wooden bench for 3 days to get to California. They were willing to pay for comfort. They were willing to pay for luxury. So Pullman spent every penny he had and spent years designing a new type of car. He called it the Pioneer. The Pioneer was unlike anything seen before. It was wider, it was taller, it had improved suspension with solid rubber blocks to absorb the shocks. It had heating, it had ventilation, and most importantly, it had folding berths that hid in the ceiling during the day and lowered at night, allowing passengers to sleep horizontally between clean sheets. The cost to build a regular car in that era was about $4,000. The Pioneer cost Pullman over $20,000, an astronomical fortune, but there was a catch. The Pioneer was so wide and so tall that it didn't fit in existing train stations. It banged against the platforms. It didn't fit under the bridges. The owners of the rail lines laughed at Pullman. They told him his palace was a useless white elephant. They told him no one was going to rebuild the stations just to accommodate his luxury whim. It seemed George Pullman had failed before he started. But then, Lincoln died. When the funeral train was being organized, Lincoln's widow, Mary Todd Lincoln, was devastated. She knew of Pullman's work and demanded that her husband's body be transported in the finest car available. The Pioneer was the only car worthy enough. Facing national pressure, the railroad companies had no choice. They had to frantically rush to cut back station platforms and raise bridges along the route so Pullman's car could pass. It was the greatest marketing coup of the 19th century. As the train moved slowly across the country, millions of Americans saw Pullman's magnificent carriage carrying their fallen hero. Newspapers wrote about its elegance. Overnight, the name Pullman went from unknown to synonymous with excellence. George Pullman didn't have to sell his idea. History sold it for him. With the tracks now adapted to his cars, Pullman had a clear path. But this is where he proved he wasn't just an inventor, but a ruthless, corporate genius. Any other manufacturer would have built the cars and sold them to the railroad companies. Here are 50 cars, pay me, and they are yours. Not Pullman. He understood something fundamental. If he sold the cars, he lost control of the quality. If a railroad bought his car and then didn't clean it or let the seats tear, the Pullman brand would suffer. So he devised a revolutionary business model. Pullman never sold a single sleeping car, not one. Instead, he leased them. The Pullman Palace Car Company operated like an airline within the railroads. The railroad company provided the locomotive, the tracks, and the conductor. But the sleeping cars, the dining cars, and the parlor cars belonged to Pullman. The staff working inside those cars worked for Pullman. The sheets, the food, the lamps, everything was owned by Pullman. If you were a passenger, you bought your regular train ticket to get from A to B. But if you wanted to sleep, if you wanted luxury, you paid in team. Extra surcharge directly to Pullman. This gave him a virtual monopoly. If a rail line wanted to compete for wealthy passengers, it had to hire Pullman, because his cars were the only ones offering that level of service. And because Pullman maintained ownership, he could guarantee that whether on a train crossing the Arizona desert or one arriving in New York, the experience was identical, flawless, and luxurious. As the Transcontinental Railroad linked east and west in 1869, Pullman's empire exploded. Suddenly, crossing the continent wasn't a death sentence or a survival expedition. It was a vacation. You could board a train in Chicago and step off in San Francisco a few days later, having eaten fresh oysters and slept on a feather mattress every night. George Pullman became one of the richest and most influential men in America. But a luxury hotel doesn't run itself. It needs staff. It needs people to make the beds, clean the spittoons, serve the soup without spilling a drop while the train jolts, and be awake at 3 a.m. to shine passengers' shoes while they sleep. Pullman needed servants. But he didn't want just any kind of servant. He wanted a class of workers who were invisible, obedient, tireless, and cheap. And he looked at post-Civil War American society and found exactly what he was looking for. He found the men who had just been freed from the chains of slavery. Here begins the most complex and morally ambiguous chapter of the empire. Pullman became the largest employer of African American men in the United States. He hired thousands of former slaves to be his Pullman Porters. Pullman's logic was coldly racist and pragmatic. He believed that former slaves were trained for service and submission. He believed they would tolerate long hours and low wages better than white men, and that rich white passengers would feel comfortable being served by black men, a dynamic that recalled the plantations of the Old South, but on wheels. For a black man in 1870, becoming a Pullman porter was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it was one of the best jobs available. It gave you a clean uniform, the chance to travel the country, see cities you would never have seen, and a wage that, while low, was better than sharecropping in the fields under the scorching sun. It gave you status in your community, but the price was your identity and your dignity. The porters worked inhumane shifts. They often spent 400 hours a month on the train. They had to pay for their own uniforms, their own food, and even the polish they used to shine customers' shoes. Their base pay was so low that they depended almost entirely on tips to survive. This forced them to be perpetually smiling, perpetually helpful, perpetually submissive to the whims of passengers who were often racist, drunk, or abusive. And there was one final rule, the most dehumanizing of all. It didn't matter what your name was. You could be named David, Samuel, Marcus, or William. To the passengers and to the company, you had no name. All porters were called George. "Hey, George, get me a towel." "George, clean this up." It was a tradition carried over from slavery, where slaves were named after their owners. By calling every porter George, after George Pullman, they were constantly reminded that they were property of the company. They were extensions of the man who signed their checks. Despite this, the porters swallowed their pride. They built a black middle class. They saved money to send their children to college. They endured the indignity because they knew they were building a future. But while the porters served champagne in crystal glasses, George Pullman was plotting something much bigger than a train. By 1880, the demand for Pullman cars was so immense that his factory in Detroit couldn't keep up. He needed to build a new plant, one bigger, more modern, and more efficient than any other in the world. But Pullman had a problem with Chicago. He hated the city. He hated the unions. He hated the filth. He hated the vices, the bars, the brothels, and the corrupting moral influence that, according to him, made workers lazy and rebellious. Pullman believed in environment. He believed that if you took a man, removed him from the filth of the city, gave him clean air, a nice brick house, green parks, a library, and a church, that man would become a superior worker. He would be more productive, more loyal, and above all, he would never go on strike. So George Pullman decided to play God. He bought 4,000 acres of swampy land on the shores of Lake Calumet, a few miles south of Chicago. He hired the best architects and landscapers of the era, and he gave them a simple order: build the perfect city. He didn't want a slum around a factory. He wanted a utopia. He wanted a city where there was no poverty, no crime, no filth, a city that bore his name and stood as a monument to his benevolence and his absolute control. Thus was born the town of Pullman. And at first it seemed like paradise on earth. But as we all know, the line between paradise and prison is often just a question of who holds the key. And George Pullman held all the keys. When the first workers moved into their new red brick houses with running water and gas, they thought they had won the lottery. They didn't know they were walking into a golden trap that would soon snap shut on them with the force of a hydraulic press. Utopia was about to turn into a battlefield. Welcome to the Gilded Cage. On the surface, life in the town of Pullman was idyllic, compared to the slums of Chicago, where sewage ran in the streets and tenements were infested with rats. This place was a miracle. The streets were swept daily by company employees. The lawns were manicured. There was a beautiful artificial lake, a theater that hosted classical plays, and a library with plush leather chairs. George Pullman had even built a magnificent church, the Greenstone Church, which stood as a spiritual centerpiece for his model community. Visitors flocked from all over the world to admire it. Economists, politicians, and social reformers walked the clean avenues and nodded in approval. They called it the world's most perfect town. They believed George Pullman had solved the labor problem. He had proven that if you treated workers like children, they would behave like good children. But they didn't look inside the houses, and they didn't read the leases. The reality of living in Pullman was a suffocating nightmare of surveillance and control. George Pullman didn't just want to be your boss, he wanted to be your father, your landlord, your mayor, and your priest. First, there were the rules. Alcohol was strictly banned. There were no saloons, no bars, no places to blow off steam after a 12-hour shift. If you were caught with a bottle of beer, you were evicted. If you were evicted, you were fired. The two were legally linked. Losing your home meant losing your job, and losing your job meant losing your home. Then there were the spotters. The company employed a network of spies who roamed the town, peeking into windows and listening to conversations. If a worker was heard complaining about wages, or talking about unions, or even if he was seen not keeping his house clean enough, a report was filed. The next day, that worker would find a blue ticket in his pay envelope, his notice of termination and eviction. Freedom of speech was non-existent. There were no town meetings. There were no elections. George Pullman appointed every official. He decided what books were in the library. He even tried to control religion. Remember the beautiful Greenstone Church? It stood empty for years. Why? Because Pullman wanted to charge the religious denominations rent to use it. He demanded a 6% return on his investment from God himself. The local clergy couldn't afford it, so the church remained a hollow stone monument to greed. But the most insidious part of the system was the economics. George Pullman charged his workers rent to live in the company houses. That seems fair, right? But he charged a premium. Rents in the town of Pullman were 25% higher than for comparable houses in Chicago. And he also charged for gas and water, utilities that his company owned and profited from. The workers had no choice. They were implicitly required to live in the town. If you chose to live outside, in the nearby village of Roseland where rents were cheaper, you were the first to be laid off when times got tough. Loyalty to the landlord was loyalty to the employer. A bitter joke began to circulate among the residents. We are born in a Pullman house, fed from the Pullman shop, taught in the Pullman school, catechized in the Pullman church, and when we die, we shall be buried in the Pullman cemetery and go to the Pullman hell. For a decade, this feudal system held together. The company was profitable, the trains were running, and the workers, though resentful, were eating. And then the bubble burst. The Panic of 1893. It was one of the worst economic depressions in American history. Banks failed, railroads went bankrupt, and the demand for luxury travel evaporated overnight. People were struggling to buy bread. They certainly weren't paying extra to sleep on silk sheets. Orders for new Pullman cars plummeted. The factory in Detroit closed. The massive works in Pullman, Illinois slowed to a crawl. George Pullman was faced with a crisis. He had a duty to his shareholders to maintain profits, and he had a duty to his workers to keep them alive. He chose the shareholders. Pullman was sitting on a cash surplus of $25 million, an ungodly amount of money in 1893. He could have easily weathered the storm, kept wages stable, and accepted a lower profit for a year or two. Instead, he decided to protect the company's dividend at all costs. To keep paying the investors their 8%, he slashed the cost of labor. The wage cuts were brutal. They weren't small adjustments. We are talking about cuts of 25%, 33%, and in some departments, 50%. But here is the spark that ignited the explosion. While George Pullman slashed wages, he refused to lower the rents. Think about the math of that. A worker who used to make $18 every 2 weeks saw his pay drop to $10, but his rent remained fixed at $8. That left him with $2 to feed his wife and children for 2 weeks. It was mathematical starvation. Scenes of Victorian horror began to play out in the perfect town. Children stopped going to school because they didn't have shoes. Families burned their furniture to keep warm because they couldn't afford coal. Workers were fainting on the factory floor from hunger. And through it all, the rent collector came every payday. The company deducted the rent automatically from the paycheck before the worker even touched the money. There's a famous artifact from this time that tells the story better than any statistic. It is a pay stub belonging to a Pullman worker. After working 120 hours in 2 weeks, and after the rent and fees were deducted, the check amount was 2 cents. The worker framed it. Desperation turned to rage. The workers began to join the newly formed American Railway Union, ARU. They held secret meetings, whispering in basements to avoid the spies. They knew that organizing was dangerous, but they had nothing left to lose. On May 7, 1894, a committee of 46 desperate men marched to the company headquarters in downtown Chicago to see the king. They didn't demand a raise. They didn't demand luxury. They simply pleaded for mercy. "Restore our wages," they said, "or lower our rents. We are starving." George Pullman received them in his opulent office. He listened to their pleas with a stone face. And then, calmly, he explained his philosophy. He told them that the business of the factory and the business of the town were separate. He was their employer in the factory, and he had to cut wages because the market was down. He was their landlord in the town, and he had to keep rents high because he needed a return on his real estate investment. There is no relationship, he said, between these two facts. He refused to budge 1 inch. He dismissed them. The next day, 3 of the men who had been on that committee were fired. It was a clear message. Sit down, shut up, and starve. But George Pullman had miscalculated. He thought he was dealing with broken men. He didn't realize he was dealing with men who were watching their children fade away. On the morning of May 11, 1894, the whistle blew at the factory. But this time, the machines didn't start. Nearly 4,000 workers put down their tools. They walked out of the shops. They walked out of the foundries. They walked out of the perfect town. The strike had begun. It started peacefully, but the atmosphere was heavy with dread. The workers knew they couldn't win alone. Pullman was too rich, too powerful. He could simply wait them out until they starved to death. They needed allies. They needed an army, and they found one. In Chicago, a convention was taking place. The American Railway Union, led by a charismatic, fiery orator named Eugene V. Debs. Debs was not a radical at this point. He was a man of peace, a labor leader who believed in negotiation. But when he heard the stories coming out of Pullman, the starvation, the 2-cent checks, the arrogance of the landlord, he was horrified. The Pullman strikers appealed to the ARU convention. A young girl, Jenny Curtis, a seamstress in the Pullman shops, took the stage. She was thin, pale and trembling. She told the room of tough railroad men about how she was trapped in debt to the company for her father's funeral, how she couldn't eat, how the utopia was a prison. When she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the hall. The room erupted. The railway men, the engineers, the firemen, the switchmen, they didn't just vote to support the strike. They voted for total war. They declared a boycott. The plan was simple but devastating. The ARU members across the entire United States would refuse to handle any train that carried a Pullman car. They wouldn't touch them. If a train had a Pullman sleeper attached to it, the switchman wouldn't switch it, the firemen wouldn't stoke the engine, and the conductors wouldn't punch tickets. They would paralyze the nation's transportation network until George Pullman came to the table. It was a brilliant strategy. But they had forgotten one thing. The railroads didn't just carry passengers, they carried the U.S. mail. And by stopping the trains, they were about to bring the full wrath of the federal government down upon their heads. The chess pieces were set. On one side, 150,000 railroad workers united in a struggle for dignity. On the other side, the combined might of the corporations, the press, and the White House. The summer of blood was about to begin. By late June 1894, the United States was paralyzed. It was the largest coordinated labor action in American history. From Ohio to California, the arteries of the nation were blocked. 125,000 railroad workers had walked off the job. Trains carrying wheat from the Midwest sat rotting on sidings. Coal shipments to the East Coast stopped. Factories shut down because they had no fuel. The American Railway Union, ARU, and Eugene Debs had proven their power. They had brought the economy to its knees without firing a single shot. Their demand was simple: disconnect the Pullman cars and the trains will move. But they were not fighting George Pullman anymore. They were fighting the General Managers Association, GMA. This was a shadowy cabal of the 24 owners of the largest railroads in the country, men who owned the steel, the land, and the politicians. They looked at the strike and saw something terrifying. They didn't just see a dispute over wages. They saw a revolution. If the workers could dictate which cars moved and which didn't, the owners had lost control of their property. So the GMA devised a trap so cynical and brilliant that it changed the course of labor history. They knew they couldn't win public support by defending George Pullman's high rents. Everyone knew Pullman was a tyrant, so they changed the narrative. They decided to involve the federal government. The railroads carried the U.S. mail. Interfering with the mail was a federal crime. Normally, trains were arranged with the mail car at the front, followed by the passenger cars, and the Pullman sleepers at the back. The strikers were perfectly willing to move the mail cars. They just wanted to unhook the Pullmans. But the GMA issued a secret order to all station managers: attach the mail cars to the Pullman cars, make them inseparable. If a striker tried to unhook a Pullman car, he would be forced to unhook the U.S. mail. It was a setup. The moment the strikers refused to move a train because it had a Pullman car attached, the railroad owners telegrammed Washington, D.C., "The strikers are obstructing the United States mail." The trap snapped shut. In the White House, President Grover Cleveland was a Democrat, but he was no friend of labor. His Attorney General, Richard Olney, was a former lawyer for the railroads. Olney didn't just want to stop the strike. He wanted to crush the union. Olney used a new legal weapon, the injunction. He went to a federal judge and obtained a court order forbidding the union leaders from communicating with their members. It was legally dubious, but it worked. Suddenly, Eugene Debs couldn't send a telegram without going to prison. But the workers held the line. They defied the courts. So President Cleveland played his final card. On July 3, 1894, ignoring the protests of the governor of Illinois, who said the state could handle the situation, Cleveland ordered federal troops into Chicago. If it takes the entire Army and Navy of the United States to deliver a postcard in Chicago, Cleveland famously roared, "That card will be delivered." On Independence Day, July 4th, 1894, the citizens of Chicago woke up to the sound of boots marching on pavement. The 15th Infantry Regiment marched into the city. They weren't there to fight a foreign enemy. They were there to break the strike. The arrival of the Bluecoats was the spark that ignited the powder keg. The strikers, who had remained largely peaceful for months, felt betrayed. Their own government had sided with the corporations. The mood on the streets turned from defiance to rage. And then, the city exploded. It is known as the Carnival of Fire. On the night of July 6th, a mob, some say it was strikers, others say it was anarchists and provocateurs hired by the railroads, stormed the massive rail yards in South Chicago. They overturned freight cars, they smashed signal lights, and then they lit matches. The scene was apocalyptic. Hundreds of freight cars were set ablaze. The fire stretched for miles. The night sky over Chicago turned a bruised purple and orange. From the rooftops, it looked like the whole world was burning. The smoke was so thick it choked the stars. The next day, July 7th, the violence reached its bloody climax. A crowd of thousands gathered at a railroad crossing to block a train guarded by National Guard troops. The crowd threw rocks and bricks. They taunted the soldiers. The commander of the National Guard gave the order, "Fire at will." The soldiers lowered their rifles and fired point-blank into the crowd of unarmed men and women. Bodies fell onto the cobblestones. The screams drowned out the train whistles. By the time the smoke cleared, roughly 30 workers were dead across the city and hundreds were wounded. The utopia of George Pullman was now a war zone, slick with American blood. The violence broke the back of the strike. Public opinion, terrified by the burning trains and the riots, turned against the Union. The press painted Eugene Debs as a dictator and an anarchist who wanted to destroy civilization. On July 17th, Debs was arrested for violating the federal injunction. With their leader in jail and the U.S. Army bayonets controlling the tracks, the Union crumbled. The trains began to move again. The mail was delivered. The Pullman cars, with their velvet seats and silk sheets, rolled once more across the country, carrying the wealthy who tried not to look out the window at the scorched earth and the fresh graves along the tracks. But what about the town of Pullman? What about the workers who lived in the perfect city? They were crushed. They had to sign a document promising never to join a union again just to get their jobs back. But many were blacklisted. They lost their homes. They were evicted, their furniture thrown onto the street by the very company police who had protected them. George Pullman had won. He had defeated the union. He had defeated the strike. He had kept his high rents and his low wages. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. The strike had exposed the dark, rotting heart of his empire to the world. A federal commission was set up to investigate the causes of the strike. Their report was scathing. They condemned Pullman's paternalism as un-American. They declared that a man should not have the power to be both employer and landlord. The Supreme Court eventually ordered the Pullman Company to divest itself of the town. They forced the company to sell the houses to the workers. The company town was legally dismantled. The church, the library, the parks, they became public property. But for George Pullman, the judgment came too late. He died in 1897, 3 years after the strike. He died of a heart attack, a bitter and lonely man, convinced that the world had been ungrateful for his generosity. And his funeral revealed the depth of his fear. His family was terrified that the workers, the men he had starved, the men he had evicted, would dig up his body and desecrate it. They didn't trust the earth to hold him, so they built a fortress for his corpse. They dug a pit the size of a room. They lined it with 18 inches of reinforced concrete. They placed his lead-lined coffin inside. They covered it with asphalt and layers of steel rails. And then, they poured more concrete on top until it was a solid block of stone and metal. It took 2 days to bury him. Ambrose Bierce, a famous journalist of the time, wrote the perfect epitaph. It is clear the family, in their bereavement, was making sure the son of a bitch didn't get up and come back. George Pullman was buried under the weight of his own iron ambition. But the story of the Pullman Empire doesn't end in the grave. Because while the man was dead, the system he created, the exploitation of the black porters, was very much alive. And it was from the ashes of this strike, decades later, that a new hero would rise, a man who would take the servants of the Pullman cars and turn them into the most powerful black political force in America. The sleeping giant was about to wake up. In the next part, we will fast forward to the 1920s. We will meet the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and we will see how the very men Pullman tried to enslave became the godfathers of the civil rights movement. The trains were running again, but the real journey was just beginning. The year is 1920. The bloody strike of 1894 is a distant memory. George Pullman is dead, buried under his fortress of concrete. But the company he built is more powerful than ever. The Pullman Company is now the largest hotelier in the world. Every night, 100,000 people sleep in a Pullman bed. And watching over those 100,000 sleepers are 12,000 black men in white jackets. To the outside observer, the Pullman porter was a figure of envy. In the segregated racist America of the 1920s, being a porter was considered the aristocracy of labor for African Americans. It was a steady job. You got to see the world. You rubbed shoulders with movie stars, presidents, and tycoons. In black communities across the South, if a porter walked into church on Sunday in his uniform, people stood up out of respect. But the reality inside the train car was a psychological prison. The porter was an actor in a play that never ended. He had to be everywhere, yet nowhere. He had to be intelligent enough to manage the complex logistics of the car, but dumb enough not to threaten the racial hierarchy of the white passengers. He worked 400 hours a month. He was on call 24 hours a day during trips. There were no designated sleeping quarters for him. He slept on the couch in the smoking car for a few hours, stealing naps with one eye open, listening for the call bell. If a passenger rang at 3 a.m. for a glass of water, the porter had to appear instantly, smiling, crisp, and ready to serve. And the pay? It was pathetic. In the 1920s, a porter made $60 a month. A decent living wage was $150. The company deliberately underpaid them, forcing them to rely on tips. This was a calculated move. It turned every porter into a beggar. It forced them to shuck and jive, to perform subservience, to tolerate insults and racial slurs just to feed their families. If a passenger called you a boy or the N-word, you didn't fight back. You smiled. You said, "Yes, sir." Because if you didn't get the quarter you needed to buy milk. The Pullman Company knew exactly what they were doing. They used the porters' race to exploit them. They told the white public, "Look how well we treat them." They told the porters, "You should be grateful we hired you at all." But the porters were not uneducated men. Many of them were doctors, lawyers, and teachers who couldn't find work in their fields due to segregation. The Pullman cars became a mobile university in the quiet hours of the night. While the white passengers slept, the porters read the newspapers those passengers left behind. They debated politics. They shared news from the North with the South. They created a network of information that spanned the continent. They knew they needed a union, but organizing was impossible. The Pullman Company had a network of spies, stool pigeons, among the porters. If you whispered the word union, you were fired at the next station. The company had crushed the white workers in 1894 with the U.S. Army. What chance did a group of black servants have? They needed a leader who was untouchable, someone who didn't work for Pullman, someone the company couldn't fire. Enter Asa Philip Randolph. A. Philip Randolph was a dangerous man in the eyes of the establishment. He was a tall, elegant intellectual with a deep baritone voice and a Shakespearean command of the English language. He was the editor of The Messenger, a radical socialist magazine in Harlem. He wasn't a porter, he was a revolutionary. In 1925, a group of porters approached Randolph in secret. "Lead us," they said. "The company can't fire you because you don't work for them." Randolph agreed. On August 25, 1925, in a hall in Harlem, he launched the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, BSCP. It was the first serious attempt to form a black labor union in American history. The Pullman Company's reaction was vicious. They didn't send in the army this time. They used psychological warfare. They fired the organizers. They hired thugs to beat up union members in dark alleys. They created a fake company union and forced porters to vote for it. They labeled Randolph a communist, a radical, and a thief. They even tried to buy him off. Legend has it that a Pullman executive offered Randolph a blank check to walk away. Randolph looked at the check and said, "You don't have enough money to buy me." The battle lasted for 12 agonizing years. It was a battle fought in the shadows. Porters would smuggle Union pamphlets onto the trains hidden inside rolled-up newspapers. They used code words. They held meetings in secret basements with the lights off. It was an underground resistance movement operating inside the most luxurious environment in America. The Great Depression of 1929 nearly killed the movement. Tips dried up. Porters were laid off by the thousands. Randolph was destitute. He was often so poor he couldn't afford shoes, walking around Harlem with holes in his soles. But he never gave up. He traveled the country, speaking in churches and lodge halls, preaching dignity. "A servant is not a slave," Randolph thundered. "Service can be honorable, but servitude is humiliating." Finally, the tide turned. In 1934, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Railway Labor Act, which guaranteed the right to organize. The Pullman Company could no longer legally ignore the Brotherhood. In 1937, the impossible happened. The Pullman Company, the giant that had crushed the 1894 strike, the company that had never negotiated with a black man in its history, sat down at the table with A. Philip Randolph. They signed a contract. It was a seismic event. Wages were raised. Hours were reduced from 400 to 240 a month. But the money wasn't the point. The point was the signature. For the first time, a massive American corporation had been forced to treat black workers not as property, not as servants, but as men with rights. The victory of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters sent a shockwave through black America. The porters became the economic backbone of the community. With their new wages, they bought homes. They sent their children to universities. But their legacy is much bigger than that, because the Brotherhood didn't just stay on the trains. They built a network, an organization. And when the civil rights movement began to stir in the 1950s, guess who was there to fund it? The Pullman Porters. It was a Pullman porter, E.D. Nixon, who bailed Rosa Parks out of jail in Montgomery. It was the porters who carried the black newspapers like the Chicago Defender into the Deep South, spreading the news of the boycotts. It was A. Philip Randolph who came up with the idea for the March on Washington in 1963. When Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and said, "I have a dream," A. Philip Randolph was standing right behind him. The old lion of the labor movement was watching the seeds he had planted in 1925 finally bloom. The Pullman Company had tried to create a docile servant class. Instead, they accidentally created the engine of their own destruction. They created the middle class that would tear down segregation. But as the porters reached their peak of power, the ground beneath them was shifting. The empire of rail was about to face a new enemy, an enemy made of aluminum and jet fuel. While the porters were fighting for dignity, the American public was falling in love with a new way to travel. The highways were being paved. The airports were being built. The slow, rhythmic click-clack of the tracks was about to be replaced by the roar of the jet engine. The golden age of rail was ending, and the Pullman Company, arrogant and slow to change, was about to hit a wall at full speed. In the next part, we witness the technological death. We will see how the car and the plane dismantled the passenger rail industry in less than a decade. We will see the mighty Pullman Company, which survived strikes and depressions, finally succumb to the one thing it couldn't fight: obsolescence. The palaces are about to go dark. The end of World War II in 1945 felt like a new beginning for the Pullman Company. During the war, the railroads had been the lifeblood of the nation. Pullman cars had transported millions of troops across the country. The factories were humming. The profits were high. The executives in Chicago looked at the booming economy and believed that a second golden age was dawning. They poured millions of dollars into modernization. They retired the old, heavy green steel cars and introduced the streamliners. These were gleaming tubes of stainless steel, futuristic and sleek. They had air conditioning, panoramic dome cars, and private toilets. They were marvels of engineering. But while Pullman was perfecting the train, the world was inventing the future. The first blow didn't come from a competitor. It came from the United States government. For decades, Pullman had operated as a monopoly. They built the cars, and they operated the cars. If a railroad wanted a sleeping car, they had to deal with Pullman. But in 1944, the Department of Justice won a massive antitrust lawsuit against the company. The court gave Pullman a choice. You can be a manufacturer, or you can be an operator. You cannot be both. You have to break the empire in half. It was a King Solomon moment. The executives chose the factory. They decided to keep Pullman Standard, the manufacturing division, and sell off the operating division, the laundry, the tickets, the service, to a consortium of railroads. On paper, it was just a business transaction. But in reality, it was a lobotomy. The company lost its soul. The unified standard of excellence, the obsessive control that George Pullman had established, began to fracture. The service, once identical from coast to coast, became inconsistent. But the antitrust suit was just a flesh wound compared to what was coming next. In 1956, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act. It was the largest public works project in human history. 41,000 miles of interstate highways were paved across America, concrete ribbons that connected every city, every town, and every national park. Suddenly, the American family didn't need a train ticket to go on vacation. They had a Chevrolet station wagon. They had cheap gasoline. They had the freedom to leave whenever they wanted, stop wherever they wanted, and listen to the radio as they drove. The car was not just a vehicle. It was a symbol of personal liberty. The train, with its fixed schedules and formal rules, began to look like a relic of the Victorian past. In 1945, trains carried 2/3 of all commercial passenger traffic in the U.S. By 1960, that number had collapsed to less than 1/3. And then, the final assassin arrived: the jet. In 1958, Pan Am, as we saw in our previous documentary, launched the Boeing 707. The math was brutal. A train trip from Chicago to Los Angeles took 48 hours. A jet did it in 4 hours. For the businessmen, the wealthy elite who were Pullman's core customers, there was no choice. Why spend 2 nights on a train, no matter how comfortable the bed, when you could have a morning meeting in New York and be home in Chicago for dinner? The palace on wheels became a ghost town. Throughout the 1960s, the decline was agonizing. Walking through a Pullman car in 1965 was a depressing experience. The velvet was threadbare. The silver was tarnished. The cars were empty, save for a few elderly widows who were afraid to fly, and a few nostalgic romanticists. The porters, the men of the Brotherhood, were growing old. The company had stopped hiring new ones. The crisp white jackets were frayed. The smiles were tired. They were the caretakers of a dying museum. The railroads began to petition the government for permission to discontinue passenger service. "It's losing money," they screamed. "Nobody rides the train anymore." One by one, the famous names vanished from the departure boards. The 20th Century Limited, the Super Chief, the Olympian Hiawatha. On December 31st, 1968, the inevitable happened. The Pullman Company, the operating entity that had served presidents, kings, and millions of Americans for a century, ceased operations. It was a quiet death. There were no riots this time. No burning freight cars, just a memo sent to the rail yards. The remaining cars were sold for scrap or passed on to the railroads. The massive laundry facilities were shuttered. The silver cutlery, the heavy china plates, the blankets with the Pullman logo, thousands of tons of history were auctioned off or thrown into landfills. On that final night, as the last Pullman-operated car pulled into the station, the porters made the beds one last time. They folded the blankets with the same precision they had used for decades. They polished the shoes. And then, they stepped off the train and walked into history. The jobs that had built the black middle class were gone. The mobile network of resistance was dismantled. But what happened to the physical heart of the empire? What happened to the town of Pullman? After the company was forced to sell the houses in the late 1890s, the town began a slow, long decline. Without George Pullman's obsessive and oppressive maintenance, the perfect city began to crumble. The brick facades turned black with soot. The parks were overgrown. By the 1960s, the south side of Chicago was facing a new crisis: deindustrialization. The steel mills were closing. The factories were moving away. The neighborhood of Pullman was slated for demolition. City planners looked at the old Victorian row houses and saw blight. They wanted to bulldoze George Pullman's utopia and build an industrial park. But something incredible happened. The residents, the people who lived in those houses, fought back. They weren't fighting for George Pullman. They were fighting for their home. They recognized that despite the tyranny of its creator, the town was an architectural masterpiece. It was a piece of American history that deserved to be saved. They formed the Pullman Civic Organization. They lobbied the state. They stood in front of the bulldozers. And in a stunning victory, they managed to get the town declared a historic district. Today, if you go to Chicago, you can still walk the streets of Pullman. The houses are there. The Hotel Florence is there. The massive clock tower of the factory still looms over the neighborhood, but it is a place of ghosts. In 2015, President Barack Obama designated Pullman a national monument. It was a final, ironic twist. The first African-American president honoring a site built by a man who tried to exploit African Americans, but which inadvertently gave birth to the movement that made his presidency possible. However, we are left with one final, burning question. We have seen the rise. We have seen the strike. We have seen the porters. We have seen the fall. But what is the ultimate lesson of the Pullman Empire? Was George Pullman a monster? Or was he just a man who tried to force the world to be perfect and failed? In the final part of this documentary, we are going to visit the grave of the man himself, the fortress of concrete and steel where he lies, still afraid of his own workers. We will look at the modern Amtrak experience and ask what we lost when we traded luxury for efficiency, and we will deliver the final verdict on the experiment that tried to capitalize the human soul. The train is pulling into the final station. Don't get off yet. In the middle of Graceland Cemetery in Chicago, there stands a towering Corinthian column. It casts a long shadow over the manicured grass. It is the final resting place of George Mortimer Pullman. But as we stand here, looking at this monument to a titan, we must remember what lies beneath our feet. This isn't just a grave. It is a bunker. Under the dirt, wrapped in tarp paper and asphalt, sits a room-sized block of concrete, reinforced with steel rails. Inside that block is a lead-lined casket. And inside that casket lies the man who built the most luxurious empire in American history, terrified even in death that the people he employed would come for him. It is the ultimate symbol of his failure. He built a perfect city to make his workers love him, and he had to be buried in a fortress because they hated him. So was it worth it? If we look at the balance sheet of history, the Pullman Empire is a paradox. On one hand, George Pullman civilized a savage continent. He took the torture of 19th century travel and turned it into an art form. He proved that Americans would pay for quality. He set a standard for customer service that has rarely been matched since. But on the other hand, he represents the darkest impulse of capitalism, the desire to own the human being. Pullman didn't just want to buy a man's labor, he wanted to engineer his soul. He wanted to control what he drank, where he prayed, and how he lived. He forgot that a worker is not a machine component. He forgot that you can offer a man a clean house and fresh air, but if you take away his freedom, that house becomes a cage. And what about the luxury? Where did it go? If you board an Amtrak train today, you are safe. You will get to your destination. But the magic is dead. We sit in plastic, seats under fluorescent lights. We eat microwaved food wrapped in cellophane. We have traded the velvet curtains and the silver platters for speed and efficiency. Perhaps that is the price of progress. The Pullman experience was only possible because of the exploitation of the porters. You cannot have that level of service without a servant class that is underpaid and undervalued. When the porters fought for their dignity and won a living wage, the math of the Pullman Company stopped working. The luxury we miss was bought with the suffering we choose to forget. But the true legacy of this empire isn't the rusted factory clock tower that still stands in South Chicago. It isn't the concrete grave. The true legacy lives in the families of the porters. It lives in the descendants of the men called George, the men who took the crumbs from the master's table and used them to build a movement. They took the discipline they learned on the trains and used it to organize the civil rights movement. They took the network of information they built across the rails and used it to dismantle segregation. George Pullman tried to build a monument to himself. Instead, he accidentally built the stage for the rise of Black America. The palace on wheels is gone. The velvet has rotted away. The silver has been melted down. But the dignity of the men who worked in the shadows, that is made of iron. And iron does not fade. As we leave the ghost town of Pullman, the wind blows off Lake Calumet, rattling the windows of the empty factory. You can almost hear the echo of the steam whistle, calling the men to work one last time. The empire has fallen. The train has reached the end of the line, but the lesson remains for anyone who thinks they can build a utopia without freedom. You can own the rails, you can own the town, but you can never own the people. Thank you for riding with us on this journey through empire dust. We exist to tell the stories of the giants who rose and fell, so we can learn from their wreckage. If this story of luxury, rebellion, and fire moved you, please honor the work by hitting the subscribe button. It helps us keep the engine running. Leave a comment below. Would you prefer the slow luxury of a Pullman train, or do you prefer the speed of modern travel? And was George Pullman a visionary or a villain? We want to hear from you. We are already working on our next documentary. We are going to explore a place where fun went to die, a theme park swallowed by a hurricane and left to rot. You won't want to miss it. Until then, remember, empires are built on the backs of the forgotten.